This week on Q&A, our guest is author and historian Ted Morgan. His 19th book will be released this week. The title, Valley of Death. It's the story of the 1954 French defeat in Vietnam that set up U.S. involvement there.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making. Presented as a public service by Standard Oil Company. At the Arch of Triumph in Paris, French Premier Laniel is roughed up by communist demonstrators. Defense Minister Plevon is jostled too by the mob, denouncing the proposed European defense community. Fanned by red propaganda, passions flame and tensions mount in France. In Indochina, an aerial counterattack is mounted to save Dien Bien Phu, reeling under the most savage communist onslaught of the war. Over the surrounded garrison, ammunition, guns, and other supplies are dropped to the heroic defenders under orders to fight to the last man. Paratroops hit the silk to reinforce the beleaguered fortress, strategic pawn in the biggest battle of the war.
Ted Morgan, that goes back to 1954. Why did you want to spend so much time on the Battle of Dien Bien Phu?
Well, for one thing, I was asked to by my friend Rob Cowley, who's a military historian and who was editing a series of books on battles. And I agreed to do it because I served in the French Army. I grew up French, and in France they have conscription, everybody serves. And it's bizarre because I was then working on a newspaper in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I thought they'd overlook me. And but I got a notice that I had to appear in September '54 to do my military service, and so I went, and I ended up serving in Algeria for a year and a half. So I knew the French. When Rob Cowley asked me to do this book, I knew the French Army because I'd served in it in Algeria. And in my platoon, there were some non-coms who'd been in Indochina, who'd served in Indochina, and so they were telling me stories about it, and most of which I can't repeat. And so I had a feel for it, and also I knew what the French sources were, so it seemed like a good fit.
Why should Americans be interested in this book? What's in here for
Americans? There's a huge American component. And it's very interesting that at the beginning, let's say from 1945 to 1950, when the French Indochina War had already started, the American Senate was extremely hostile to any kind of interference, having just sent troops to Japan in World War II. And in the immortal words of Lyndon Johnson, who wanted to rely on air superiority, and he said, without air superiority, every yellow, without air superiority, we are at the mercy of every yellow dwarf with a pocket knife. That was the attitude. So Truman did decide to contribute to the Indochina War, but the real change came with Korea in 1950, because Korea had a border with China just like Indochina had, so Korea was sort of like a second front. And The Red Chinese were supplying the Indochinese, the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, with arms and trainers, literally thousands of trainers, to teach them guerrilla warfare, which they'd just been through with the Japanese in World War II.
What book is this for you? How many have you written?
That's the 19th.
And of all those books, which are the ones that you like the most?
I like different ones for different reasons. I like my my biography of Churchill because it was a finalist for the Pulitzer. That's the reason I like a book. And then I wrote a series of short stories that were more personal. I like that too. So it's like, you like your children for different reasons, One is a football star, the other one's first in class, or you might like the one who's a laggard, I've had a couple of laggards.
Well, as you've in 19 books, it's a lot over how many years?
Oh, more than 50.
Somerset Maugham?
Maugham was 1982.
Why did you write?
1980.
Why a book about
it?
him?
You see, here's another interesting thing. Why does a writer write books? Sometimes it's for something that just comes out of left field. I had a friend named Patrick O'Higgins, who was a very amusing fellow, but highly unreliable. And he had written a book on, he'd worked for the woman that made, she was sort of a cosmetics hairdresser queen, and it was a book called Madame, and it was a big bestseller, so he did very well on that with Simon & Schuster. And then they wanted him to do another book, and he said, "Oh, I'll do a memoir on Maugham, whom I knew very well." He didn't know Maugham. He spent one weekend at Maugham's house in the south of France. So I was doing a lot of journalism then, and my name was in the Times magazine a lot. So he called me up and said, "Would you do me a favor and take over this Maugham book? Because I can't do it, I'm dying of cancer." And he was dying of cancer, and when I went to interview him, because for the little he did have, he said, "Just don't make me laugh because I go into convulsive pain." And so he started laughing at his own jokes, and he fell off the couch in pain. But that's one reason why I did a book, simply because he asked me to, and then I realized there had never been a full biography of Maugham, and that I spent a lot of time and talked to a lot of people and got a lot of good material and wrote a pretty good book.
Here's a book that I know you'll remember, On Becoming American, which was written back in 1978 or so. The interesting thing, and I know you've told this story 1,000 times, but we got to hear it here for the first time. Ted Morgan, formerly known, and how do you pronounce it?
Oh, Sanche was my first name, but my last name was de Gramont, Degramont, and Ted Morgan is an anagram of de Gramont.
Why did you change your name?
Oh, because I under my old name, Sanche de Gramont, it was constantly being mispronounced and misspelled, and I remember when I was on the Worcester Telegram, the managing editor, Frank Kelly, he one time they spelled my name wrong in the byline. The Sanche de Gramont, and so I said, "Frank, they spelled my byline wrong." And he said, "Who will know but you?" And he was right.
And what year did you change your name?
When I became a citizen, and when I came back to the States in '74.
You first came here what year?
Oh, I came in when I was a boy because my father was a French diplomat. And then we went back to France when the war started, and he joined the Air Force and was killed. And then we went back to, spent the war years in Washington. And I mean, I was constantly going back and forth. I went to school here, and then I worked for the Herald Tribune, and I was sent to France again. So my final return was in '73 when I became a citizen and so on.
How much time did you spend at Yale?
Well, having had a year at the Sorbonne, I only had to do 2 years instead of 4. But I had to keep a certain grade average up, which I did, and so I got through in 2 very wonderful years.
And you were an aristocrat. Did you have the actual title of Count?
I had the title of Count, and I remember when I was in Paris, I was sort of hyperactive, you know, and always running around, and so that my nickname in French would be le compte courant, which means the running count, but it also means the running bank account. Le compte courant is a bank account, so I was called a running. But I was glad to give all that up.
Why?
Oh, because, you know, I love my family, and I see a lot of them in France, and now they're doing much more interesting things. But the idea in my time was that I should marry a rich woman and live off my land, you know. And they had a castle outside Paris, and it just wasn't. I'd had too much. I spent too much time in the United States, you know, to live that kind of life.
Another one of your books, Reds, which I have here in paperback version. What year did that come out? Do you remember?
Reds came out, I think, in '92.
And this, you know, it starts in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, goes all the way to after 9/11. What was the point of this?
That's a good question, because there again, I had a problem, which was it started out as a book on Joe McCarthy, but the papers, which are in Wisconsin, are under the control of McCarthy's daughter, and she won't let anybody touch them. See, so I went up to Wisconsin. There was a library guy who was very helpful to me, that he was able to show me some stuff, but I couldn't. So I realized I can't do this biography of McCarthy with enough new stuff. So I'm going to turn it into a book on the rise of communism in America and the McCarthy years, a sort of history of the struggle between communists and government, and going through periods where there are committees that go after the communists and they go too far. But there was also authentic espionage. There were spies all over Russian spies all over the United States as a result of FDR recognizing the Soviet Union in 1933, when he became president, in order to have commercial ties with the Soviet Union. But since they had 2 consulates and an embassy, they stuffed the consulates and the embassy with spies. And that wasn't found out until much, much later, after World War II.
Where would you say, where you get your interest in all these different things?
Well, that's the thing. I've never been the kind of writer who spends his entire career on 15 minutes of the Battle of Gettysburg. I just can't do that. And so I like to move around, but I like to spend very intense periods of time, you know, working on one topic. And somebody asked me, how can you write this book like Reds in 3 years? Because I do nothing else, you know. As a guy who teaches has his teaching obligations and doesn't have the same amount of free time that I do. I don't do anything else. So I'd rather switch from one topic to another, you know, if it's something I really want to do.
Where do you live now?
In New York.
Married?
Oh yeah, married. I've got 2 children and 4 grandchildren. but not by the same wife.
How many times have you been married?
3.
The first one, I read somewhere about a Nancy, and then there's an Eileen somewhere in there.
That's my present wife, Eileen, who actually went to Dien Bien Phu with me and took the photographs. And I was very happy to see, if you look at the photographs in the Dien Bien Phu book, that there are 10 of them that Eileen took.
But let me ask you about Dien Bien Phu. Obviously, we're going to talk about that, but about the trip there. First of all, when did you start the research on this book?
As soon as Rob Cowley asked me to do it, which was in 2005, I started the research, and I saw it was available mostly from French sources. And I also saw that I had to go there because you really can't tell what a battlefield looks like from photographs. You have to go there and examine it yourself. So I went with my wife because she's a very good photographer.
We'll come back and ask you more about that trip, but first, here's some video from Time Life Films where they have a little bit of a segment that's kind of set up the environment that you were writing about.
In September 1945, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese League for Independence, known as the Viet Minh, took Hanoi from the Japanese occupying forces and declared independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In the south, the Japanese surrendered to the British. However, France still considered Vietnam her colony. General Gracie, the British commander, ordered the Japanese rearmed to fight the Viet Minh to retake the colony. Thus the French Indochina War began. In the war between the French and the Viet Minh, the United States had until recently stayed strictly neutral. U.S. officials had originally supported the Viet Minh and its leader Ho Chi Minh, and they also strongly opposed the French attempt to keep their old colony. However, that was before the rise of Communist China. Now, the fear was that if the Viet Minh beat the French, they would open the door to the Chinese and the Soviets. Cold War politics had come to Vietnam.
How is that as a setup? Would you agree with most of that?
There's a very interesting point that hasn't been completely made, which is that what I call, or what's been called, the first partition of Vietnam. And they don't say it in the clip, but the first partition of Vietnam was the result of the surrender arrangements that were made at Potsdam. It's fascinating, and it's not that widely known, that you take the year 1945, FDR dies in April, Germany surrenders in May, Truman becomes president and goes to Potsdam in June to see Churchill and Stalin. While he's in Potsdam, he gets the news that the atom bomb is operational. That makes surrender arrangements rush to the top of the things that need to be done, because the Japanese are going to surrender within months. Surrender arrangements are extremely complicated, and particularly in Asia, with the Japanese in so many different places. So they decided that the Americans would handle, they didn't know that the results of the bomb, of the A-bomb would be, so they thought they'd have to invade mainland Japan and round up all the Japanese soldiers and make them prisoners of war. At the same time, there were 2 million Japanese in China that they had to go and get. Surrender arrangements are incredibly complicated. They tie up your entire navy. So in terms of Indochina, the combined chiefs of staff, including Mountbatten, they decided that Indochina, no American troops would go in. This was the partition. They divided it in two. In the north, you'd have the Chinese come in. In the south, you'd have the British.
Chinese then were not communists.
The Chiang Kai-shek Chinese in 1945. Truman wrote a letter to Chiang Kai-shek, would you mind doing this? Chiang was delighted to do it for a number of reasons. And so here was the partition, which was exactly the same partition, the 16th parallel, that existed after the Geneva Conference divided North and South Vietnam once again. But it all begins with the surrender arrangements that the Americans stayed completely out of.
Before World War II, what was Vietnam like?
It was part of French Indochina, which comprised Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam. But the Indochina War began with Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. And then, but the point I'm making about the surrender arrangements was the French, they gave the South to the British, the North to the Chinese. The French were left out because the Vichy French had allowed the Japanese to invade Indochina as a jumping point that spread all over Southeast Asia. So they deliberately left the French out. They didn't particularly like de Gaulle at that time either, and they said, well, de Gaulle's not ready, he doesn't have the ships to bring the men in. And so the Chinese will do it in the north, the British will do it in the south. But so what happens, the British turn the south over to the French, and the Chinese turn the north over to the Viet Minh.
And the Viet Minh, what does that mean?
The Ho Chi Minh government.
He's leading the Viet Minh.
He's the leader of the Viet Minh, and he's declared chief of state. And the French slowly, by increment, having gotten the south, they start moving up north, and they finally chased Ho Chi Minh out into guerrilla warfare. But the surrender arrangements gave the north to Ho Chi Minh and gave the south to the French.
You say in your book that Harry Truman was, I don't want to overcharacterize it, was in favor of the domino theory that we listened to all during when the Americans were involved in Vietnam. If one country falls, the rest of them are falling.
Well, the domino theory held sway for a long time, that if one falls, the rest falls. But it's very interesting, for instance, that the British never believed in the domino theory. And the reason why the British were happy with this surrender arrangement, because they wanted the partition of Vietnam, because the South, which would not be communist, would be a buffer for their colony of Malaya. They were having trouble in Malaya. Malaya had been invaded. They were fighting Malayans, the Malayan insurgents. So the British policy was always to have that buffer of South Vietnam, you see.
When did the actual war between Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, led by General Giap, who, believe it or not, as you know, is still alive today?
I know.
98 years old.
Amazing.
And when did that war get underway between Ho Chi Minh and the French?
45, when the British surrender forces turned it over to the French, then the French started pouring in troops, and they moved up until they they played games with the Viet Minh, pretending to that they would give them some kind of independence or something, but it all blew up, and Ho Chi Minh had to leave Hanoi and go into guerrilla warfare. Now, as soon as that happened, which was after 1945, the Chinese communists started helping the Viet Minh. But the real aid started, when Korea began in 1950, that's when the Americans got interested. That's when Truman first gave a $10 million aid package to the French. It was Korea that did it.
Okay, let's go to the early part of '54 and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which your book is about. When did you go to Vietnam? When did you go?
I went to Vietnam in January 2006.
First trip?
My first and only trip.
How did you go?
Flew by Thai Air to Bangkok, New York, Bangkok, and Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City.
And then from Ho Chi Minh City?
Bangkok, Hanoi, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City, I did exactly what the French did, practically with the same kind of plane they still got. Flew from Hanoi to Dien Bien Phu, because even now the roads are no good. And one of the huge problems was that the only way the French could get back and forth was by plane, fly in, fly out. They're still doing it today. There are 2 flights a day.
What's it look like there in Dien Bien Phu? Is it like a valley?
It's a long valley, very, very green, like a golf course now, today. And so you come in over these very rocky, barren mountains that surround it, and all of a sudden you see this beautiful, lush green valley. And then you land right on the airstrip that the French used. Although now today it's cement. Before it was steel plates, and it's a very bustling town, very commercial town of about 9,000.
What's the importance of that battle, and when did that Battle of Dien Bien Phu happen? What's the date?
That is the key question of the battle. Why did an insignificant, distant battle that could only be reached by air become the decisive battle that ended the war, threw the French out of Indochina, and led to the second partition? That's the question. Why?
What's your take on it?
Well,
Why did it happen? And how many people, by the way, what was the extent of the damage there at Dien Bien Phu? How many people were killed, injured?
Okay, the extent of the damage. Dien Bien Phu, when the French parachuted in November 1954, the beginning of the battle, which lasted from 1954, November 54 to May 55, about 6 months. Dien Bien Phu then was not. It was a little tiny village with houses on stilts, but the Viet Minh had a battalion there, and they had an airstrip. So, why? There was one reason was to please the Americans, because American aid was starting to come in, and in '54, Eisenhower was president. Eisenhower had a low opinion of the French military. They weren't really fighting in Indochina. In fact, one of the American consuls there in Saigon wrote a wire to Washington. You got to tell the French to get off their butts. No. You got to tell the French to get out of their Beaujolais forts and instead of sitting on champagne cases.
So, if you get right to the nub of it. Had the French won at Dien Bien Phu, would we have avoided fighting in the Vietnam War?
That's a very good question, but it's possible, because had the French won at Dien Bien Phu, yeah, but there's another problem there, which was the Geneva Conference was on, and the French wanted to end it. They wanted to end the war. Yeah.
They did. Did they want to get out?
But, well, because Dien Bien Phu fell just at the time of the conference. Okay, if Dien Bien Phu had not fallen, the Geneva Conference could have come to a different conclusion. United States aid could have multiplied, and the Vietnam War could have been avoided. Yes.
So when you went to, but how many books have been written about Dien Bien Phu? Many?
Oh, many. Well, I've got a lot of new material in there, because during the time that I was writing it, I had access to, you know, how in France they were turning out book after book of recollections of the veterans of Dien Bien Phu. You know, a book of letters sent from Dien Bien Phu, a book of comments by veterans, and so on and so forth, volume after volume. And so I had that, and I had, because after the battle there was a commission that secretly met of general, Air Force general, admiral, and civilian civil service guy that interviewed all the major characters that survived the war.
French.
And that commission of 1955, the results were not released until 1969. So all the books that were written before that, they didn't have the results of the commission, you see. And then the books that were written after that, mostly in France. The great classic is Bernard Fall, but Bernard Fall came out in 1956.
Let me divert for a moment, because you talk in your book about meeting Bernard Fall and a dinner with David Halberstam.
David Halberstam was a great friend of mine. We were in the Katanga together. That was my first, when I was a foreign correspondent at the war in Katanga, where I got shot in December 61, the war in Katanga, you know, and the war between the UN and the Chumbe. And I was actually shot by Swedish UN troops.
Seriously?
No,
were you wounded badly?
They fired a bazooka at the car we were in. 1 dead, 2 wounded. I was lucky I was in the back seat.
But you met David Halberstam.
So Halberstam was there too, but he wasn't. He was doing something else. So we became friends then. Then I was on the Herald Tribune, and they didn't have many foreign correspondents. It was the last days of the trip. So I was Rome bureau chief. When the Ngo Diem, the Buddhist monks and the overthrow of Diem, 1963. Was
Diem prime minister then, or was he president of South Vietnam?
What's that?
Was he president of South Vietnam at that time?
Ngo Diem. That was when he was overthrown. Ngo and his brother, the Buddhists, you know, and so I was Rome bureau chief. They sent me to Saigon from Rome. I didn't know much about it. But Halberstam, my old friend, was there. He was, at the Times, he was my competitor, but he took me with him everywhere. He was a wonderful guy.
But Bernard Fall, I mean, I remember when the Vietnam War started, a lot of us, including myself, read his book.
That's a classic.
Classic on the Vietnam War.
But
before
he wrote a book on Dien Bien Phu. Oh, The Street Without Joy.
Yes.
But he wrote Hell in a Very Small Place, which is a book on Dien Bien Phu. That was the classic. But with the new material that I have, I've written a completely different book, because I have much more about the American involvement, you know, and much more about the Geneva Conference and stuff like that.
Go to the American involvement, because, you know, with the theory that this battle, eventually we got into the war there in the late 50s and early 60s, how much were we involved at Dien Bien Phu, and in what way?
Well, it started out under Truman, who gave $10 million, okay? Under Eisenhower, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu started, and they started giving serious money to the French. But there was a big argument whether the Americans should send troops, but they did send a lot of advisors. There was an MAAG, Military Assistance Group, in Saigon, and the French were always complaining, oh God, there's too many Americans here. At the same time, they were begging for money, for millions to subsidize the war. And one of the problems why they had manpower shortages in the French army were that they didn't send the conscripts. Like I was, every French guy is supposed to serve his military service, but they didn't send them to Indochina. They passed a law that no conscript would be sent to Indochina because the war was so unpopular, you see. So it was a professional army of professional soldiers. But another curious point, you were asking me when I went to Dien with my wife, we visited the parts of the battle that they kept completely the same. Like the commanding officer, Colonel Castries, he had an underground bunker, and you step down into it underground. It's still there exactly the way it was, and the roof is corrugated steel, oval, so it can withstand artillery shells. He spent the entire battle inside his bunker. He never went out. And he had secretaries there, and he had maps and everything. The maps, the Viet Minh, or Vietnamese today, they've kept the same maps on the wall. So I took notes, because there's one map where he makes lists of the military, all the French forces. Less than half of those French forces were French. The other half were Foreign Legion, mostly Germans.
That's what when I read that, I couldn't believe it, that the French Foreign Legion were Germans.
Yeah, but quite a few deserters. French Foreign Legion, Vietnamese, a lot of Vietnamese. Every French, even the elite paratroop battalions who fought at Dien Bien Phu were from 25% to 50% Vietnamese. So, and Gap made propaganda out of that and said the French army is an army of mercenaries. We are an army of coolies, peasants. We are an army of Vietnamese peasants who have learned how to fight for our land.
Here's a little clip of some more from that time-lapse series on the American involvement.
By 1953, a year into the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. support for the French war against the Viet Minh had turned into a flood of arms and cash. The United States paid 3/4 of the cost, a staggering $1 billion in 1954. The problem was that even with colossal American aid, the French were failing to beat the Viet Minh. The guerrillas now numbered 120,000 trained troops, backed by 200,000 local fighters. As French casualties passed 50,000, in France the public grew weary of the seemingly endless war. There were calls for negotiations with the Viet Minh.
How does that sound to you?
There's something very interesting there. That when you showed the aircraft, okay, the Americans gave the French quite a few ships, including several aircraft carriers. Now, this is what really made Eisenhower mad. One of those carriers was 6 months later had not reached Vietnam. So he said, find out why. The reason it had not reached Vietnam was that the French had sent that carrier covered with planes to India, where it had a contract to sell the planes.
How'd you find that?
I can't tell you the exact piece of research it was, but it's...
You did have a number, and the number of B-26s that we provided for them. Do you remember the number in the book?
60, I think. But the problem with the planes also, the planes, there were only two airfields that could handle those planes. One was in Hanoi, one was in Haiphong, the big port. So the French had a limit to the number of planes they could use, you know. But they also had teams of American repair people to repair the planes, because they were using the planes all the time.
You know, and I can remember back during the Vietnam War that people like Robert McNamara would say, we didn't have experts that understood that part of the world. That's one of the reasons that we made the mistakes we did in Vietnam. Didn't all these folks live through this period where the French lost? Didn't we learn anything from that?
Absolutely. And there were a lot of experts that had spent a lot of time in Indochina, because MAAG had a big team of people in Saigon. They traveled all over Indochina.
Could you talk to any of these people that were there in the preparation for your book? Did you find any of the
mostly dead. So, but they've left memoirs, and you know, there books that they've written, and you've got very good Navy histories written by U.S. Navy specialists, you know, on that period, and they give you ship by ship exactly what was sent to the French and how it was used and everything else.
We also have some videos showing I guess you said it, the coolie labor, but I mean the fact that these Vietnamese were able to carry things on their back and go through it's like the old Ho Chi Minh Trail that we used to read about all the time during the Vietnam War, and you can see there on the screen. What was it, in your opinion? Was it the big debate in this country, was it the communists coming down from the north and Ho Chi Minh was a communist wanting to take over, or was it a civil war in your opinion? Was all this a civil war, or was it communism trying to take over?
The French part of it was a colonial war, because the French were the colonial power, and Ho Chi Minh wanted to get rid of the French colonial power and establish independence for Indochina. Later it turned into something else. But to get back to what we were saying before, there were probably several thousand American militaries that went through Indochina at that time, on the ground, being part of various missions, you know, who knew an awful lot about the country.
How much of that was covered by American newspapers back then?
Dien Phu, all the time, every day, but daily. But
and what was going on inside the American government?
Inside the American government.
And who was on what side in all this?
Inside the American government, you had Eisenhower's deep misgivings that the French could win, coupled with Eisenhower's anti-colonialism. Eisenhower kept telling the French, "You've got to free things up. You've got to do something for the people, because if we help you as a 100% colonial power, we will be tinged by your brush as a colonial power. You've got to," but the French kept promising, but nothing ever happened. And General Navarre, who was the one who planned the Battle of Dien Bien Phu
for the French,
and made the horrible mistake that led to the cataclysm. General Navarre kept saying, "I'm building a national Vietnamese army." This national Vietnamese army never amounted to a damn, because there were deserters all over the place. They didn't want to fight. The officers weren't trained. So this supposedly always expected nationalist army never came to.
So back inside the American government, you had Eisenhower, but what about John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State? Where was he?
Okay, what Dulles wanted to do was to help the French, but only if America did not have to act alone. So he was trying to bring other allies on board, like the British and the people in the area, like the Australians, you know, and which happened after the battle was over, the Southeast Asia Conference, you know, that brought those together. So he was working on that all the time. Eisenhower, who in his heart of hearts really didn't want to send troops, was backed by the chiefs of staff who said, this is a lost war, it's just a waste of manpower, you're going to be there for 10 years, it's going to be like Korea all over again. And Eisenhower insisted they had to, you know, you can't go to war without a congressional resolution. So Eisenhower told Dulles, well, Dulles wanted to draft a resolution for Congress that they would vote on. Eisenhower said, wait a while, you know, see if the Allies come aboard, and finally, the Congress said the United States should only send troops to Indochina if the other Allies also send troops. So it was the other Allies weren't about to send troops, so it was a dead letter. And Eisenhower in his memoirs said, Dien Bien Phu was a trap. It was the worst possible place to fight a battle when you're in a low valley surrounded by mountains, you know, and it was the worst possible place.
What, in your opinion, did Ho Chi Minh and General Giap and all that have that, you know, made them continue working hard, and they won? I mean, what was it they had that the French didn't have, or for that matter, the Americans when they came along?
Well, if you're talking about
years later,
the battle.
Well, not just the battle, but just in general, what did you find in the Vietnamese people when you were doing your study?
Okay. First of all, they never have a shortage of manpower. They can bring in tens of thousands of coolies, tens of thousands of young men that they can train in China. The French had a terrible manpower shortage, bringing troops over all the way from France and finding the troops. Because don't forget that at the same time in Europe, they were building a European defense community with all the armies of Europe. So the French had to contribute to that too. So when they were stretched between the European defense community and the Indochina War.
From what your studies are over the years, what made us as a country think we could beat them in the Vietnam War that we eventually got involved in, after what we had seen and what President Eisenhower had seen and John Foster Dulles had seen during the French involvement? Why did we think we could?
Hubris. We think we've got the best army. We think we've got the greatest soldiers. We think we've got the armament. A colonial war can never be won. It's for the same reason the French had to get out of Algeria. They've got home field advantage. It's their country. They can raise tens of thousands of recruits.
You had something interesting, and I read in your book, Reds, and I had not seen this before, but those who are historians from this period, no doubt this will not be new information. And it only relates in the sense of our involvement in Americans today don't know what our involvement was. This was back in World War II. You say here on page 224 of your book, Reds, between 1941 and 1946, during the war, America sent the Soviets $11 billion in Lend-Lease, including 3,000 airplanes, 581 ships, and more tanks than they could use. Also sent were entire factories from petroleum cracking to synthetic rubber, complete with operating manuals and engineering drawings. Is that $11 billion on today's money or back in those days? And the money.
Probably today's money.
And what was the purpose of that back during World War II? Why did we?
Because the Russians were the only ones who were fighting the Germans until D-Day, until North Africa.
Did we as a country debate this in those days, or did they just send them?
Oh, there was a huge isolationist movement in America during World War II. that was against the war and stayed against the war. Look at Lindbergh; he was their most vocal spokesman. But in the Indochina War, there was that same isolationist strain, particularly among Southern congressmen and among Republicans, and in the Republican Party, so that the press, the McCormick press, they were very isolationist. So FDR had a terrible problem. Without Pearl Harbor, we wouldn't have gone to war.
So we're, after all these years and 19 books and looking at the world through whether it's the Reds or FDR, a book on FDR, where do you come down on all this? Do you have a point of view?
I have many points of view on many issues. I don't have one global point of view. Sometimes I think history is a series of accidents. It's like a pileup of cars in a snowstorm. I mean, it's amazing just to go back to that first partition of Vietnam, which was a surrender arrangement that turns into a series of wars. First, a war between the French and the Viet Minh, and then a war with the Americans.
So you go back to Potsdam. That's where you.
Well, that's one example of the only law that really applies is the law of unintended consequences. You do one thing and you get another.
Would that have been any different at Potsdam had FDR been there instead of Harry Truman? I mean, Harry Truman's brand new president.
That's a very good question, because Truman was an untested president. And in fact, I found in a letter to his mother, Truman was taller than Churchill and Stalin. But he wrote his mother, "I don't know why the press keeps referring to me as short at Potsdam." He was the tallest of the three. They kept calling him short. But
and after all these books, what have you learned about research?
Oh, research. It's unending. But you've got to know where to find it, I mean, for instance, I had no idea that Texas Tech University had a tremendous amount of material that they just recently obtained about the Geneva Conference and what Molotov was sending back to Russia and what Chu Enlai was sending to Mao Zedong. They've got all that stuff now, and I've got it in my book, and it's just come out.
Did you go to the Texas Tech?
No, it was on the internet.
Did you ever find out why Texas Tech happens to have this?
Oh, because they have a big program of Vietnam studies. In fact, they gave me certain issues of Viet Minh magazines that are almost impossible to find. I couldn't find them when I went to Dien Bien Phu. And
did you find out why Texas Tech started the whole project on Vietnam?
Well, they just decided to do it. I was in correspondence with the guy that runs it, but I never asked him why he wanted to do it. They've just been doing it for years, and so they sent me those magazines, where I found wonderful stories, like the story of the people that were carrying food, big bags of rice by bicycle for 300 kilometers to feed the troops. So it's coolie power against air power.
And do you read this in French?
Yeah, yeah.
And so if you didn't know how to read French, that would be another setback for you.
If I didn't know how to read, I couldn't have done it. You got to be able to read French.
In your book of Reds, you write about the Venona papers. Did you spend time with those?
I had the full series of Venona papers, thanks to someone I was introduced to at the agency that puts it out.
Who puts it out? Where do they come from?
The spy, what's it called? The documents.
National Security Archives?
Yeah.
And Venona papers originally came from, they're Russian.
They're decrypts of Russian codes, and they're the ones that reveal Alger Hiss and on all the other stuff. And in fact, there's some fascinating stuff that I've never been able to use, like what was going on in Mexico with the assassination of Trotsky and stuff like that. I've got it all in my Venona.
Do
I
you
got
have
a huge box like this of Venona papers.
Are you going to do another book?
Well, you know, publishing's in the doldrums right now. So I'm working on an idea, yeah.
So after all the writing you've done and thinking you've done about the world, who would you name as some of your most favored leaders?
Favorite?
Yeah. What leaders in history do you admire the most?
What writers?
Leaders.
Oh, leaders?
Yeah.
Leaders? Leaders. Well, what leaders in history? I admire FDR a great deal. I think Eisenhower was a great president. I admire George C. Marshall, great military leader among the Americans.
Where do you put Ho Chi Minh on this list?
I admire Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had the perseverance and the undergoing great difficulties to prevail, and made overtures to the Americans at the time of the OSS in the earlier part of the war.
That's on the screen is the House of Stilts right there in Hanoi where Ho Chi Minh lived. He supposedly lived there instead of the mansion that was behind it. Have you been to the House of Stilts?
Yeah, but and the people who were his hosts didn't even know who he was.
Ted
He
Morgan,
was so modest. You know?
we're out of time. I want to make sure we talk about the name of your book, The Valley of Death, the tragedy at Dien Bien Phu that led America into the Vietnam War, and we thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it was a pleasure.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Next Sunday on Q&A, author and photographer